collabs, it's like, is this the title you want to go live with? And we're live. Hello, friends. Welcome to Friday and the Kudomusicology Ludomusicology Literature review stream. I almost said podcast. It feels like a podcast. Like we could go audio only on this, and I bet it would work. Put it up on one of the apps. So I'm your host, Musicologess. And today we are having another one of our collabs with the fabulous AMS Ludomusicology study group. So we have Stefan here as our representative from the AMS study group. Hello, Stefan.
Hello. Hello.
And congrats on your upcoming position, right?
Yes.
Thank
you. I mean, contingent on the defense. It'll be great. It'll be
When
great.
is your defense, may I ask?
It's in 2 weeks. Exactly.
You're getting so close. And we are all
Yeah.
chomping at the bit to read that dissertation. So exciting that will probably a few weeks after that'll be more accessible, I imagine. So
Yes.
Wow. way to take time out of your schedule preparing for that to join us today.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know if I had any brain cells where I could have done something like this 2 weeks before my defense. But
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
it's fine. Getting some echo. Hold on. All right. This is always a problem when I have multiple people, so I have to figure out. That's probably what it is. Say hello, both of you.
Hello again.
Hello, everyone.
So hopefully that took care of it. But if not, chat can let us know. Today, excellent. Yeah, it's when I added the second NDI source. I didn't mute it properly, so because I usually only have one other person or just me. So it's a learning process. Today we are joined by Elizabeth Medina-Gray, and hello. We're going to be looking at interacting with soundscapes, music, sound effects, and dialogue in video games, which I love. This is a fantastic chapter. I think everybody can assign this to your classes. It's just such a nice way of looking like at a holistic picture of the soundscape and everything that's happening in it. And it just gives some beautiful examples of sort of how to do that analysis and put the different elements in conversation with each other. I usually describe it to my students as having like a zoom in versus a zoom out approach. So like maybe you listen to the OST on its own and you listen to the music and you sort of identify all the musical features and do that analysis. But eventually that's going to fall short and you're going to want to put it back into, okay, what's happening in gameplay? What all other sources are happening, you know? So this is a really, really beautiful piece, and I'm really excited that we're doing it. Windows
Thanks,
keeps
Dana.
just like auto resizing. It's what it is. I'm not quite sure why that's happening. It's probably a Skype thing. So yeah, this is in the. I keep wanting to say brand new. It's not brand new at this point, but it's newish. This is in the Cambridge Companion to Video Game Music. Nice, chunky, wonderful book full of good things that we will be looking more at, I'm sure, as we keep going. And this was edited by Tim and Melanie. And then, came out last year. And we've just been all trying to make sure we've read the whole thing since. And, I think Julianne has read the whole thing because she reviewed it. Other than that, I would be curious to have a show of hands in the chat if anybody has managed to read the whole thing yet. So tell us a little bit about where this came from.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bunch of kind of threads, I guess, that this chapter kind of pulls together. So parts of it come out of my dissertation, which was finished in 2014. So like the Super Mario Galaxy example is in my dissertation. So notes to people working on dissertations, you can keep pulling on that stuff for years to come. The earcon and auditory icon stuff, I first started looking at that while I was doing the dissertation. So those are the like starting points, but then in I think it was 2015, I had a NACFIGM talk, and then I did the same talk at SMT, the Society for Music Theory, that same year, where I did kind of the next steps after my dissertation, and that feeds into this as well. So thinking about blurred boundaries between sound effects and music, and when can sound effects sound like music, and how can we analyze them maybe in that way. So those thoughts were all kind of hanging around, and Tim and Melanie, reached out and asked if I wanted to write something for this volume, and those were things that I really wanted to dive more into. And they had a kind of some suggested chapter out, like titles that might work, and one of them was interacting with soundscapes, and I was like, can I do that one? Because I really want to dive into sound effects and music, and I was really starting to think more about voices and the weird sounds that video games sometimes use with voices or with dialogue. So I wanted to take this opportunity to dive into more of this stuff, and it was a lot of fun. I think I was digging back in my emails. I think it was 2018 when we did our first rounds of drafts for this. So
sounds about right. Yeah,
the edited volumes tend to take, in my experience, 2, sometimes 3 years.
Especially
to go
one this
into
big.
Publication.
This is one of the biggest ones that I've seen so far, I think.
Yeah, I know. Tim and Melanie did a fantastic job.
Yeah, they really
wrangling everything. And yeah, they were great to work with, of course. Yeah, it was a fairly smooth experience as far as I remember.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I got to do it. It was super fun.
Yeah, I remember that NACFIGM talk because everyone was talking about beep speech, and basically anytime that comes up now when we're streaming or anything, we're like, where's Elizabeth? So feel free to come stream with us, by the way. If you ever have a Thursday and a game, we could look at anything that you're currently doing. We haven't done Flower on stream yet. That could be a fun one. And so, that would be a nice chill stream. Everyone just hang out. And then, Stefan, once you've defended, you have to come stream with us too. I'm just recruiting people to the Thursday night streams as well. Because it's fun. And the guests always get to pick the game, so and then Ryan or whoever figures out how to play it. So some people have given him challenges, but some of the games are a little more playable. Depends what it is. Let's dive in then. Unless, do you have any opening questions from the AMS side of things?
Nothing yet. Maybe after the next slide or two, but not yet.
Sounds good. Feel free to interrupt. So we are outlining that, hey, we're all musicologists and theorists, but music is only one form of game audio, which we all know that. Sound effects are a big piece, probably one of the biggest pieces of the soundscape. So often my students are like, you hear more of that than the underlying sound. If you're playing a first person shooter, it's all gunshots, and they're all giving you important information, and it's spatialized, and so there's important things happening. So we can have all kinds of different sound effects, ambient sounds, interface sounds, sounds tied to game world actions, and then we can also have dialogue, voice acted, so any of the speaking voices, but also, as we'll see, some more abstract representations of speaking voices. Mm-hmm. This is what I decided your thesis was. A potential thesis is a broad approach that considers all components of video game soundscapes and that acknowledges relationships and potentially blurred boundaries between these components, opens the way for a greater understanding not only of video game music, but also of game audio more broadly and its effects for players. Seems like a good argument.
That sounds like what I was trying to say in this chapter. Yeah. Thanks, Dana.
So our central ideas, to kind of flesh that out further, are that music, sound effects, and dialogue can be distinct and discrete categories, and the sounds can often be pretty easily categorized into one or the other. But, as you say, the interactive, innovative, and technologically grounded aspects of video games often lead to situations throughout the history of video game audio where the distinctions between these categories are not actually very clear. A particular sound may seem to fit into multiple categories, or sounds seemingly from different categories may interact in surprising ways. what I love about this is I sort of had to do a chapter like this in my dissertation because I had a lot of non-game people in my committee. And so they, at one point, I think my advisor had made a comment about like just having like a taxonomy of like form and function. So I have a whole chapter on that. But, you know, I'm not a theorist. I don't build these kinds of frameworks. So I really like the way that you've described these. I ended up using an actual spectrum. So, like, I assigned everything colors to be cute. So, you know, and I'm trying to remember what the red side of the spectrum, wherever I started. I think I start with, like, you know, I have dialogue in there. I have music. I had one that I think I referred to as like quasi-musical sound effects or sound cues or something like that. And I would basically toss that entire chapter now because I think your way of framing it is just so much clearer and easier to apprehend. And I never wanted anyone to be like, oh yeah, this is a violet effect. Like that wasn't the point. I was just being cute. Because I described it as a spectrum, and so therefore,
yeah. I'll throw out there. They're definitely like this is definitely not the only way to think about these things. Like you know, I like you said, I am a theorist, and I do like making categories.
Yeah. It helps the rest of us.
And charts and those kinds of things. But I mean, absolutely, this is just kind of what was making sense to me at the time, and like I'm continuing to reading the chapter again, always kind of reading something that you've written a couple years ago. There's always things where you're like, maybe I wouldn't quite say it that way now, but I think I'm still feeling pretty good about those categories in general. And yeah, there are definitely other ways to think about these things too. But I'm glad that you're finding it helpful. That's great.
Find it helpful. I'm like pulling up my dissertation now. I'm really curious if I jump to chapter 2.
I'd love to see the colors.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a question in the meantime, if that's okay, Elizabeth.
Sure.
So, in film music studies, you often hear of this kind of vococentric paradigm where, the voice is, at the top of the hierarchy in much of film, at least. And like, of course, we can problematize this and blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, right, it's a vococentric kind of paradigm. Do you think that actually carries over for video games, or do you think it's way too blurry? And obviously, it's it's going to depend on genre and blah, blah, blah. But
that's a really good question. And I was like, while you were saying that, I was just thinking about like audio mixing, like the kinds of like real-time mixing that games will do sometimes while you're playing. And I feel like, at least when I've been paying attention to it, which has really only been the most recent game I've been playing, is like the mixing will go way down with the sound effects and the music when a character is speaking. Like it'll like cut out so that the voices will come through more clearly, which lines up with what you were just saying.
Yeah.
So my impulse is maybe, especially when there is voice acting, I guess that's needing to convey like some information through text. That makes sense to me. I hadn't really thought of it that way before. That's cool.
Yeah.
I sort of wonder if we could, and I don't know who's done this yet, but if we started thinking about like categorizing dialogue itself, because like NPC, like you're just walking past and you catch a snippet of conversation dialogue, is more like world building and environment.
Right.
And those things won't happen in the soundscape because they're meant to be kind of just part of the texture. I'm thinking of like The Witcher 3 in particular, where I'll just be like walking around in one of the big cities and you just like hear little bits of people talking, but they're not foregrounded in the same way, even though there's like a ton of voice acting happening there.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So,
I'll throw out too, you'll notice that I spend less time on dialogue in this chapter than I do on sound effects and music. There's definitely room to flesh out those kinds of things. I like those categories you were just suggesting, Dana. That's cool.
Yeah, well, that just thinking about film music and like Walter Murch and like all this stuff I've read about like mixing and how you can kind of like have a hierarchy in order to have intelligibility in your soundscape. Just starting to like flesh that out further. Looks like I wonder if I should just throw this to the stream. Maybe I should throw this to the stream. Hold on. Well, here, let's dig through my dissertation, because this is all about me.
Yeah, but I want to see the colors.
Yeah, that's what I figured it was too easy to. And I'll share that screen with y'all over here. Switch. Bam. Okay. Good times. So, hello, dissertation. I haven't opened you in a while. You always keep a folder, though. In my network storage, I always have that ability to kind of go back to it. We will just prop it at the bottom here. There. Okay, so we're just going to throw that over top. Yeah, so as I started out, I was like, all right, what have other people done? So I look at Annabelle Cohen's functions of music in film and how those might map on. And then one of the big ones, at least at the time of writing, was Karen Collins with like also a functional taxonomy, right? Non-dynamic, non-diegetic, all of those. And trying to remember, anyone still have to look those up when you use them? It's like I understand what all the words mean, but sometimes I'm like, wait, okay. Interactive, non-diegetic. It's like so modular, I have to think through each component.
Yeah.
So this is a useful little thing for myself. And I say it's very ludic because it's very much how the sounds trigger and play. I looked at Zach Whalen, Rod Mundy's 3-tiered analysis in terms of environmental, immersive, and diegetic elements. And then talk about what diegesis is. It makes Andrew Powell really mad because he wants to just throw diegesis out the window, right? Right, Andrew? Let's anger you on this beautiful Friday. So then I keep going. I talk about trans-diegetic stuff from Jorgensen, Karen Collins again. And then, yes, silence is my first one. And this was actually pretty much drag and drop from a NACFGM talk I gave early on. That became that section. So infrared, I guess I didn't have enough. I had to go like beyond the visible spectrum. But that makes sense for silence.
That does make sense.
That makes sense. Let's see. Yeah, and I talk about Metroid, Super Metroid in particular, for its very chilling use of that. Then red, I called psychological silence in the unheard. So that's more of like habituation, like the idea that you're no longer consciously attending to a musical stimulus. So that's kind of a cognition thing. So the music doesn't stop playing, but you sort of stop attending to it. And that there are games that sort of do that are more psychological in nature. And then scroll. I did a lot of transcriptions in this dissertation. I'm very happy with that. And I've only gotten better at that. Orange is sound effects. And I kind of described it, I think you said 2 seconds or less. We'll get to it in yours, but kind of similarly, I talk about Pong and things like that. Let's see. And I actually specifically mention like things that aren't agreeing with the underlying musical track to better serve as a signal. So like Legend of Zelda, the one heart sound tends to not agree with the underlying heartbeat. I think I have that somewhere. Then yellow and green are musical signals. That's what I called them. Quasi-musical signaling tracks. So that's kind of like a clunkier way to say what you end up saying. And then what was atmospheric stasis? I don't remember. I don't even remember my own dissertation. It was a while ago. You forget it so quick, and it's so many pages. You're just like, I don't know. Oh, yeah, this is basically like the Wiley stage 3/5 cue where like it doesn't go anywhere musically. It's like total drone stasis. Even though it's like it seems like it's gonna keep rising, it just like doesn't. It's very redundant. Very repetitive. Blue and indigo. Music for mood and atmosphere. Ludic Foley. Interesting. So yeah, then I kind of hit like music, qua music. At the end. Do I have, I don't think. Oh, I do. I have Violet, and then I get to like music. So, yeah, that was my cutesy little attempt to have a thing. And then I have ultraviolet, which is complete autonomy, which is basically like, theorizing that there could be stuff that like is completely disconnected from the game image in a way that's like incongruous and absurd. So, talking about like uses of music that don't seem to fit very well. And then Taste the Rainbow. Adorable. All right. That's enough of that. Let's look at this said smarter. So, games are certainly not unique in having blurred audio boundaries. And you cite here some work by Claudia Gorman and Richardson in film. And you're sort of just laying out definitions here and pointing out like sort of the precursors. That the term soundscape is coming from R. Murray Schafer's work. I feel like I've been reading a lot of people citing Schafer lately because I'm reading ahead for folks that are going to be on stream. So Elizabeth Hambleton in the the Navigable Narratives article talks about Schafer, and Kate Galloway coming up talking about Stardew talks about Schafer. So certainly I think it's worth every person that's in the field reading some of that stuff because it does get you thinking kind of beyond the music that we're trained on and how, we can think about all of these elements contributing, all perceptible sounds. And so apparently this is sometimes only applied to diegetic sounds. I was curious about that. Because you said here specifically, I'm going to use it here to apply to everything. Why do people limit that in that way? Like, is it?
If I remember correctly, I think I was mostly noticing that in Mark Grimshaw's work. And he was especially interested in first-person shooters and kind of the audio ecology of first-person shooter games. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think part of his argument was even that many players, turn the music off. So kind of non-diegetic sounds like music or underscore could just be not part of the thing that they're considering. So I think it just depends on what, the player is paying attention to, what the analyst wants to take into consideration when you're thinking about these things. But I'm especially interested in just basically, all these weird sounds that games make, whether they're, within the world of the game or interface sounds or anything like that. So take it all into account. But I didn't in this chapter also look at like sounds in the real world, which you could absolutely also like bring in like sounds of button presses and hardware and physical
you mentioned in the dialogue section being on like if you're playing like a multiplayer game and you're online and you're on mic and you sort of allude to like that could be future work is talking about like the idea of like adding player dialogue to what's happening.
Folks have definitely started looking at that, like Will Chang definitely does some stuff with that in his book. It's also super fascinating. I just had to draw a boundary somewhere. Yeah. And like for myself, I'm not super interested in those sounds yet, like, right now. But boundaries are good.
Yeah. We all have to have a scope. When I do literature review with my game students, so often it's, well, why didn't they do this? Why didn't, XYZ? Why didn't they give 18 more examples of games? It's like, well, we usually have word counts and sometimes, or, they'll say like, oh, they make reference to this entire like discourse. Why didn't they explain what it was? And it's like, oh, that's the model of like in journalism, you're going to explain all of it. And not assume that people are going to go seek out those citations. I'm like, the model in academia is a lot different in that we're sort of building on it and taking that time to be like, well, here's every single thing that person said. If it's not central to what you're doing, we just don't have the space to do it. But I think it's also just like not how we operate in general. Even if we had unlimited space, we sort of recognize like that's why we put the citation in there, folks. Can go figure it out or, try to at least get a sense of it from context or, Google a term we don't recognize. I do that when I'm reading like medievalist stuff sometimes. And I'm like, wait, what is this term? Nothing wrong with that.
Is that a question in the chat? I wasn't paying attention. It kind of went by. Someone said something about being confused.
Oh, yeah, just about whether you were using the colors, and I was just kind of specifying, like, no, that's my own BS.
Got it. Okay,
That was just trying to show that, like, this is something that we've needed. This chapter was something that, like, if this had already been out when I was writing my dissertation, I wouldn't have needed to write that chapter. So it actually, I could have just cited this and moved on with my life, but instead I had to, like, try to come up with a thing, and I'm not a theorist, so, like, coming up with my own frameworks is not really my strong suit. It was fun. I mean, it was fun to sort of, like, try to think through what are all the different sounds I can think of, what other ways of classifying sounds are out there, and then sort of get from there. You know, it's all about, like, building out your toolkit. So, you know, you can go read Collins and get into, like, her dynamic audio, and all the different ways that she's describing it, and then sort of put that in conversation with something like this. Sorry, I think the cat is trying to get in. Keep hearing my door. So yeah, that was just an interlude. Had nothing to do with this beautiful chapter. So we get to what I call the walkthrough statement. This chapter, usually that's a clue, as if it says, like, this chapter or this article.
Yeah.
This chapter first considers music, sound effects, and dialogue in turn, and highlights the particular effects and benefits that each of these three audio categories may contribute to players' experiences with games. During the discussion of sound effects, this chapter further distinguishes between earcons and auditory icons, following definitions from the field of human-computer interaction, HCI, which this chapter will reference in some detail in order to help nuance the qualities and utilities of sounds in this larger audio category. The remaining portion of this chapter examines ways in which music, sound effects, and dialogue sometimes interact or blur together, first in games that appeared relatively early in the history of video game technology, when game audio primarily relied on waveforms generated in real time via sound chips, rather than sampled or pre-recorded audio, and then in some more recent games. This chapter especially considers the frequently blurred boundaries between music and sound effects, and suggests a framework through which to consider the musicality of non-score sounds in the larger context of the soundscape. Overall, this chapter encourages consideration across and beyond the apparent divides between music, sound effects, and dialogue in games. Nice thorough walkthrough. I appreciate that. I like a walkthrough.
I do too. Yeah.
As a reader, I find it, you know, I'm increasingly finding that I like kind of like ease of use stuff like that, because the more reading you have to do, the more it's like, oh, good, I know exactly where this is going. And then I get a sense of, like, if I'm reading it for something, because I'm trying to reference it, I have a better sense of, you know, how it's going to function in my own research. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and when I'm taking notes for myself when I'm reading something, that's the part that I'll copy and paste into my notes.
So nice, yeah.
Oh, here's what this chapter does. Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
I even do, I do like a little like synthesis summary for myself when I get done with it. I do like, and sometimes I don't do it immediately. Sometimes I percolate for a few days, but I go back and I put in like usually at the top of my notes, like, sort of, how do you plan to deploy this? Is this like, this is an interesting detail, you know, is this is going to be a foundation that I'm really drawing on? I like to kind of outline that for myself, or is it just, oh, there were a couple really good quotes in here, maybe I'll use one of those. So I kind of think about, you know, synthesizing, like, how am I going to deploy this in the actual chapter that I'm writing? So start with music. This is the category of sound that features some ongoing organization across time in terms of rhythm and or pitch. Nice, tidy definition. And this does include that there are kind of semi-musical sounds that have pitched tones, but there's a threshold, right? To be read as music, it sort of has to have enough onsets, enough rhythm in time to register as music for the player.
Yeah, this is my attempt to define music. It's like, I guess I'm a music theorist, I probably should be able to come up with some sort of definition. And yeah, to kind of set it apart from the way I've defined sound effects later. Yeah, it's kind of the best I can come up with, but yeah.
It's notoriously hard to define, so this was very tidy, as I think Dana just said.
This is tidy, yeah, because
yeah.
John Cage has the whole, what is it, sounds organized in time that a lot of people cite. But okay. I like that you mentioned pitch here too. But
yeah, rhythm and or pitch. I don't know. I was trying to keep things at least a little broad. I don't know. And then it's like, what do I mean by rhythm? I don't know. A bunch of onsets. What do I mean by organized? I don't know.
So, you're like, this chapter isn't about that.
It's kind of I mean, it's like you said, Dana. It's kind of like, what does a listener like kind of understand as music? Like, so I guess organized could mean different things to different people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I remember in music cognition courses talking about like parsing an auditory stream, and the example given was if you have a leaking faucet and it's dripping, how close do the drips have to be to each other for you to recognize that as a single source and go, oh my gosh, my faucet. Versus like if it's intermittent enough, you'll sort of forget and it won't be connected for you. So you can have these individual rhythmic elements, but as they get closer together, you might read them as more musical or as more connected to each other and kind of parse that as a single auditory stream instead of just like isolated things happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's also that famous, was it Diana Deutsch example, where it's the voice, the spoken voice, and then just when it's looped and repeated, eventually starts to sound musical, or well, I would say it starts to sound musical. So
it's like what 70% of people would say that it would start to sound musical or something like that. Yeah,
or I like using like a auto tune and recognizing that regular speech is toned, but it's irregularly toned in such a way that until we do that kind of like repetition or we run it through that filter, we don't always pick up on exactly what pitch we're sitting at. Yeah. So anyway,
I love all this stuff. Yeah.
Do you have to be enough onsets? I liked the use of the term onsets because that's sort of describing the rhythm here to register as music. But you can have things. Again, this is where the blurred boundaries start. In that things can be more or less approaching music, and so then you also say some of the functions under each category. So for music, we can suggest emotion, we can provide info about the environment or the characters, and I like this too. You mentioned inspiring close and imaginative engagement with video games, as in fan arrangements and attending game concerts, kind of similar to Julianne's chapter from a couple weeks ago, and all of that labor outside of the game.
I just feel like music's pretty special. I don't know. That's kind of, I feel like we all kind of feel that way.
A little bit.
I hate music. I don't know why I do this.
Get some of that in there. But,
yeah, totally. Yeah. I think we all connect to it on, an emotional level, and we build our histories through it. And not that there aren't certain sound effects that like capture us. And, I think of the Kefka laugh in Final Fantasy VI is one of those like, that sticks with you, and that's something that is powerful to people. But so there can be really iconic sounds that stick with us. But yeah, it seems like music is something people will. I don't know. Do people listen to like collections of the sound effects outside of gameplay versus like listening to a soundtrack? That's a question. I did it once for my dissertation when I was doing fighting games. I looked at all of the sounds in isolation, but that's kind of the only time I've done that.
I don't know about necessarily like seeking it out to listen as it's, kind of autonomous on its own necessarily, but people definitely reference them in kind of like a mimetic sense. So saying like, oh, I'm going to insert this sound effect, like actually during a stream maybe or something. And it's like, it has that kind of association of whatever, I don't know, game over or something, right? And it's like, oh, I know what this is referencing, but it's not necessarily saying like, I'm listening this for... Maybe this is a loaded term, like valence, but like, aesthetic pleasure or something like that.
Yeah. But you're right. We can use them like in TikToks, or is that the correct term for the pluralization of a TikTok? I don't know.
As far as I know, yeah.
I don't really use TikTok. I'm more of an Instagram, like we'll just leave it up kind of person. Even stories disappearing, I'm like, this is stressful. TikTok and like, what's the other one where they disappear? The app where you send things to people.
Oh, Snapchat.
I have an account somewhere, but I like never sign in because I don't know. I like TikTok. I like when TikTok gets like shared to me from other people and I don't have to seek it out myself. That's I'm lazy about it. But yeah. So there are a lot of, or like YouTubers inserting sound effects from games, and like those can have really humorous effects, or, you know, they can really highlight what they're doing and kind of go along with it. So they can do some of this like environmental info or like suggest emotion too. But I think music does this really well. So then we get to sound effects. I love this distinction. Music defined by content, and here sound effects are being defined by context. It's clever, and it works. And so the sound effects are the usually brief sounds that are tied to the actions of players and in-game characters and objects. These are the sounds of footsteps, sounds of obtaining items, sounds of selecting elements in a menu screen, and so on, as well as ambient sounds, which are apparently produced within the virtual world of the game, but which may not have specific visible sources in the environment, so like crickets. And if you are playing Stardew Valley and it goes to nighttime and the track for spring or whatever stops playing and you just hear crickets, and it's beautiful. So the functions of sound effects, and there are different types that we break down further here, but the functions are generally to enrich the player experience and their sense of the virtual environment, and they are often communicative as well. And the reason that we define it by context and not by content is because the content of sound effects really has a big range. So we can have synthesized tones, pre-recorded actual sounds from the real world, you know, that are very realistic. We can have really abstract, kind of iconic representations. And so therefore, we can break these down even further. So this is where we get into auditory icons and ear cons. And this isn't the first time you've done ear cons in your work.
No, so like I said, that part starts off in my dissertation. So I do in the course of my dissertation, mostly just because that whole thing was about thinking about how to analyze multiple aspects of a soundtrack when you're playing a game in real time. So like when sounds layer on top of each other, or when a piece of music switches from one to another. So that was when I started like noticing and paying attention to these little sound effects that are musical in some way. And so therefore I wanted to think about them together with the score. And so this distinction I ended up finding in some literature from the HCI literature, so human computer interaction. A distinction there those terms first started cropping up in the late 80s, I think, in that literature. So it's from a design perspective, they were trying to think about what different kinds of sounds can we use in our interfaces to help users understand what's happening in the computer. So that distinction, ear cons and auditory icons, and I just really liked it because it seems to, for me anyway, latches on pretty well to like auditory icons being, as you said, they're natural, everyday sounds. So like something realistic that you can kind of immediately connect to the meaning, versus ear cons, which in the literature that I've looked at from the HCI literature, it is usually these tones, like pitched tones that are synthesized, very abstract. And it just seems like those happen a lot in video games. So it felt pretty good to bring those terms that way. And I mentioned in the chapter too that other people do use the terms ear cons, auditory icons when talking about video games as well. So I'm not the only one who's brought these in, but they have kind of flexible meanings depending on who you're reading and who you're talking to. I guess because they're nice terms and they kind of latch on. I like ear con because it's like it's an icon but for your ear.
Yeah.
That's pretty great. Love it.
I am writing out the citation because somebody asked for the full citation, so I'm writing it from the chapter itself.
Oh, sure.
So.
Yeah, that's a nice summary from like a big handbook for human-computer interaction. Oh, yeah, right? Icon as icon? We should do that.
Icon, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's the specific source of these two definitions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and do I have it on the next slide? You have some examples of each of these as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So a good example of an auditory icon is when you go to empty your computer's trash folder. There's that kind of rustling paper type sound. It makes as if you were actually dumping out like your office trash can and it was filled with papers. Or like the bag rustling or something like that. So in games, this is things like footsteps, sword swings during attacks, or clicks or taps in a menu. All very naturalistic connections for the player, versus the ear cons are often semi-musical and constructed with pitches and rhythms, and even if they aren't, though, the associations have to be learned through repetition. You have to hear it a few times to go, oh, okay, that means that, there's a treasure in this room. Like, maybe I have a sensor on that, like some kind of thing that tells me like, oh, I need to look a little closer. That's not necessarily going to be clear until you've done it a little bit. So it's more abstract or musical in deployment. Although after you have some fluency with games, there's something to be said for like categories of ear cons being established as like just kind of generic ludic ear cons where like healing sounds I think are going to be sort of recognizable even if I'm in a new game maybe. So
that's really interesting. Yeah,
like they still teach someone who's maybe never played a video game, but I think if you've played a bunch of video games, maybe like that uptake is a little quicker where you go, oh, that's probably like a healing sound or like something good is happening because it's like a bell tone and it's high or like whatever it is. It sort of has that timbral quality that you're like, oh, okay, that I think that's that. Or Pete has talked about coin collecting and currency, like money sounds, and how you can have like cash registers and things like that. And those effects, I guess that's kind of auditory icon in a way. Depending on how realistic that sound effect is. But it's being used to kind of be like, oh, you're collecting money or something. So the coin collecting or jumping sound effects in Super Mario Bros. Are a great example of this because the jump has the boing, but it's a pitched tone. It's not an actual recording of somebody jumping, which wouldn't sound like that at all.
Which wouldn't sound like that. What would that
There's
sound
just
like?
a thud when I land, right?
I mean, when I jump, I have that sound, but I mean, maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I really want to know how to turn on my sound effect menu in real life here. I've never found the interface. But the coin collecting too is what it's like a fourth, but
something like that. Yeah, I was gonna say there's definitely a video I've seen at some point where someone puts in realistic sound effects along with Super Mario gameplay, and it's like really disturbing. Yeah.
It's like Uncanny Valley, which I know Will has been interested in, like the idea of like an auditory Uncanny Valley where it just it feels wrong. Yeah, Mario doesn't thud. It's interesting though, like Mario, the sound is all about like the motion up and then back down because like I had a section in the disc too where I actually transcribed it. I slowed it down 800% and then like figured out what the pitch was, and it kind of goes like up and down and back up slightly at the end. It's weird, but it's emphasizing his motion, right? Like it's sort of like mirroring it to you and Mickey Mousing it in that way, but like Mega Man actually has more of a almost like you're bouncing when you land. It goes like ba-dum, ba-dum. Again, slowed down like 800-900% in Audacity. It's still a pitched tone, but it's kind of an opposite trajectory. So it's interesting that it's like Mega Man's almost like confirming like, okay, the platforming here maybe is a little harder than Mario, I don't know, but like it's confirming the landing versus the takeoff. But we can still recognize them both as jump sounds.
I saw a question in the chat about considering music and sound effects as conceptually different.
Go for it.
And is this coming up on like the next slide or something?
I don't know.
Because I
you mentioned content versus context.
Yeah, so
it just goes to dialogue next. So yeah, speak to that.
I would consider sound effects like by themselves as maybe semi-musical, like maybe hinting at that they could become music. Because again, if a sound effect is a brief sound that's of some action in the game or in the player's interface or something like that. But if it has if it's a pitched tone, like I would say that's semi-musical. It has musical-ish qualities, but it's not yet music because it's not that kind of sustained organization. But that's absolutely what I wanted to explore in this chapter.
And that sort of sustained organization might prevent it from actually communicating something, right? Because if it's showing up quickly, it's usually because it's telling you something.
Like in that moment.
Yeah, you got a coin. If you kept it going, you no longer read that as I just got a coin. You read that as, I don't know, celebratory fanfare for getting a coin, or like.
I mean, that's what I was wondering. So what about the Legend of Zelda and the the treasure finding queue, basically?
Yeah, I would. If it's long enough that it's like that, you would call it a fanfare. Basically, I think I'd call that music.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, because fanfare itself is kind of we probably get that from a music perspective, right? So yeah, like a treasure finding, a rhythmic kind of thing, or like there's multiple chords. I would probably call that music. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I like the comment here about having this action doesn't work here sounds when you're like being prevented from doing something, because it's true. Silence, or it makes you go, is the controller broken? Like that, right. It makes you feel heard. You're like, okay, it's not, I can't do this. It's not that there's something wrong with the game. Silence can be really hard. You have to deploy it really carefully for it to not be read as something wrong. Yeah. And then on the idea of like quantizing sound effects to the musical key, that gets brought up later, so stay tuned. Let's move forward. Yes. So then dialogue is kind of our last like big category, and of course there are ways we've already talked about ways to break these down within these. So this is all sounds of characters speaking, which can include voice acting in modern games, but there are other possibilities in earlier gaming due to the limitations and affordances of that technology, and how much space fully recorded speech would take up, so that we come up with these more, I guess, ear-conny ways to represent dialogue to the player. So here, we're providing semantic content. So we're providing info, and it's giving us, it can also, through timbre and other elements, give us a glimpse into the character. It can give us the goals of play. It can give us narrative content. It can convey the affective and emotional content, the way that a player's voice actor's delivering a line. It can help us identify with our avatars. And then you do touch on this sort of in a, like, the future work can look at this kind of way. Players adding their own voices and dialogue to a game, playing MMOs. And then you mentioned like Will Cheng has looked at this in a negative light, unfortunately, with harassment in those spaces. But I'm even thinking, and I don't know how much work there is on this yet, but the idea of like a Let's Player or a Twitch streamer who... Game Grumps do this a lot because they're like kind of the big Let's Players on YouTube that got that genre off the ground. When they're playing games, they read all the character dialogue in character. So you get folks that they're like coming up with, whenever they play like a visual novel, Aaron Hansen does like kind of a generic surfer guy voice, which is always really funny because it's like these Japanese games and he's being like, so then I saw Sayuri at the bus stop and I was like, hey dude. And so they're adding like their own character. They're making it, they're adding humor. They're making it funny. It's also kind of like a nice accessibility thing to have that extra confirmation and not just like it's going by and we're not reading it. It's nice to have that as well in the VOD. So yeah, we can have players add their own voices and dialogue playing together, both online and in these kinds of like Let's Play spaces too. Yeah. So then we get to blurred categories. So right from the start, we sort of have things sitting at the boundary, and a lot of this has to do with like the audio synthesis and using waveform generators and these pitch tones that are coming out that we're using as sound effects because we're not using actual recordings yet. So a lot of things sort of sit at this boundary, and Pong is a great example. We have pitched square wave tones for the ball both hitting the paddle or the wall, and the tone is different depending on which it is. And Tim Summers has noted that this sits at the boundary between sound effects and music. That's in Understanding Game Music that he talks about that.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So sits between the boundary of sound effects and music in that you could sort of read like a game of Pong as like a kind of abstract, but you could read it as a musical piece. Is that the idea? Like it.
Yeah.
You're reading
kind
it
of
as the score,
too,
maybe.
Right, because there's no other score in the game. It's just those pitched tones with the sound effect, and so maybe like you get into a rhythm. It can kind of build that kind of sense. Maybe that becomes music in a way.
Yeah. I was gonna say you can actually see this real and actualized with like the video games live medley, where they start with Pong the back and forth, and then it turns into this medley of video game music. So it's playing with this and musicalizing it, I guess, in really interesting ways.
Oh, that's perfect. Love it.
Maybe I'll pull that up here at the end. When and you mentioned like again, this is about when you string it together, it might we might start parsing it as music, even though like in this chapter's definitions, like we'd call those sound effects. But especially there's nothing else that we can go, oh well, that's the music and this is the sound effects. So that's also a piece of it too. And I'm thinking also of Neil Lerner's work where when he talks about like Space Invaders and that 4-tone bum 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 bump, like, okay, is that the score? Or is that, it's speeding up as they are speeding up? So is it like them marching toward us?
Oh, yeah.
He sort of mentions that there's a little bit of ambiguity there too, that like we could call that a score, but it also maybe has this element of kind of like Mickey Mousing to the action in such a way that you might be able to read it the other way. But he doesn't use like, it's very much in passing, not central to his, he's looking more at comparisons in early games to like silent film and early sound in film.
That's a really interesting example, because I do feel like I usually hear people just call that music, like just call it the score without questioning it, but pointing out what you just pointed out and what Neil pointed out, that makes me think, oh, maybe there is like a sound effect aspect to that, and that's that's also great. Like that's a nice example. With the blurred
and in that case,
boundary.
you do have shooting, so you do have like another thing that you can displace and say, well, that's the sound effect, and so this might be the underscoring. But like, there's kind of that mirroring quality of the action that makes it like not sit squarely in like a non-diegetic music space. If those are even useful distinctions in games.
Very cool.
So in the NES era, we had the 5-channel programmable sound generator chip, PSG chip. So we had 2 channels that were devoted to creating pulse waves, one for triangle waves, one for noise, and one sampler channel, which wasn't as frequently used, generally due to space issues. It could be quite costly in terms of your space to use that sampler channel. Sometimes it gets used in more abstract ways, but we won't get into that today. And you point out that this means that we only have those channels. We don't have separate sound effect channels. So we have to co-opt one in these early games. So gameplay yields a soundscape in which certain channels are going to switch immediately back and forth between producing music and producing sound effects. So in Super Mario Bros., getting a coin triggers that sound to actually disrupt I think it's the Pulse 2.
I think that's right. But
because
it's the melody.
It's the harmony,
channel.
Is it the melody or is it the harmony?
No, I think
melody?
It's the melody. Yeah, I think so. There are certainly some sounds that disrupt the melody, and I think the coins is one of them.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting, right?
And in the example I mentioned earlier with Zelda, when you're down to 1 heart in a dungeon, it actually takes, I think, Pulse 2. It takes like a harmony voice, but the way that the dungeon in particular, it has this like stacking da 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 da, and it's traveling up the channels in that arpeggio. So you end up hearing, instead of da 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 da, it goes da 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 da, because the middle voice is now being co-opted for the bleepy heart.
How interesting.
And that's like something as a kid I don't think I ever noticed, because like your brain is hearing that a lot and kind of almost hearing it as if it was all still present. So I think the brain does a lot of like making up for the thing that's missing once it's been established and we know it. But then going back, it's like, oh my goodness, this is missing. It's being totally dropped out in order to play this other sound, which is communicating with me, which clashes harmonically and rhythmically with everything happening underneath. So I can't absorb it. I have to pay attention to the fact that I have 1 heart and the musical sound effect Earcon is being annoying about it and causing some anxiety here. So the limited sampling capabilities meant that games generally couldn't capture the voice act dialogue with any kind of regularity or fidelity. There are some examples of like single moments of like a word, like fight or Sega. And how much space the Sega took and how important that was to their branding, that it took up so much space on the cartridge relative to the actual Sonic the Hedgehog game. Yeah. Ooh, lots of very active chat here. Yeah. Oh, wow. They did a Kickstarter for the Video Games Live scores.
Yeah, they've done this a few times. I need to look into the specifics of this a bit more to be
I feel like
very
Tommy
honest.
has been kind of obsessed with other things. And so I just haven't seen as much on Video Games Live. I mean, it's also been pandemic and things haven't been touring.
Yeah.
And all that. But because he took over, what's the console that he's helping make? He's like re-releasing Tommy Tellerico console. Intellivision. He took over the Intellivision. Yeah. So I feel like that's been his big thing.
Yeah.
He's off that project now. Yeah. For a while I felt like that was all I was seeing from him was talk about Intellivision. Which I was like, wow, this is fun. We're really going back. So we get to our case study. Dragon Quest 1986. Hooray. Or Dragon Warrior if you played it over here, Why did they change it from Quest to Warrior? Like,
I think I read there was some sort of copyright issue.
Okay.
But I forget what the copyright issue was.
So it's not like we think Warrior will do better with this audience. It was just like yeah.
I'd have to double check that.
Interesting.
/ look it up on Wikipedia. But
yeah. I had played Dragon Warrior 3 was my first one. So
I've never played any of the games.
Really?
Only in research, yeah.
Oh man. Yeah. I liked I really like 3. I think that's kind of my like the bias with the one I played first and then going back and doing the earlier ones.
I lied. I played about 60 or 70% of Dragon Warrior 7 and it was really fun.
Yeah.
The one where you go to different islands and there's like warping and time travel.
I haven't done that.
I don't know.
I've only done the early ones. That's one of the. I've always enjoyed the gameplay of those games because it's not Final Fantasy. It's a similar thing, but it feels different. So I've always enjoyed those. But here we have a really excellent example of an early game that is using the blurred boundaries. And then later you go on to show that like this isn't just a limitation thing. This isn't just that it's, this is early game audio. We don't need to do that anymore. Games are consciously still doing this. So something gets kind of aestheticized in this era and then continued. So early sounds evoke voices, and you mentioned here that Tom Langhorst has suggested that the pitch glides and decreasing volume in the failure sound in Pac-Man makes this sound kind of like laughter, like there's like a giggle that you failed. And so similarly, Dragon Quest provides a really great case study because, as you say, music is generally relegated to pulse 1 and triangle in this game, so we have kind of a 2-voice, almost pianistic texture, which... tune in next week for Will Gibbons because he talks about the scoring in this game in particular being kind of neo-Baroque. Right. He doesn't use the term neo-Baroque. He just says it's Baroque-ish for reasons. We'll get there. But so we have more ability to have sound effects happening where it's not going to interrupt the texture. So the sound effects tend to be happening in pulse 2 and noise. Music is generally pulse 1 and triangle. So now we get to beep speech, although you don't use the term in this entire chapter.
I don't, and I have to credit Jenna Stieber. I just learned how to pronounce her last name. She's a Polygon researcher. She has a video on Polygon in 2020 about the sounds of dialogue in Animal Crossing: New Horizons, and it's fantastic. And she uses the term beep speech, and I like it mostly because it makes me think I'm not the only person who thinks these sounds represent speech or voices. Yeah. So credit to her. And yeah, I haven't used that term in any publications. I used it in some presentations, and I do like it. So
is there a reason you decide not to use it in publications, or just don't get around to it?
So I didn't use it in this chapter because I didn't know about it then. I think by the time this went to press, I hadn't seen that video yet. And then the reason why I haven't used it more recently is just that I'm not entirely sure like how far that term would extend. Like, I think it really clearly applies to things like Dragon Quest, where it's literally a beep going along with speech. But then with things like, so I'm writing a chapter now about abstract representations of voices in video games, and so that could include things like more of like a gibberish speech sound.
Like in The Sims, yeah.
Symbolish,
yeah. So like beep speech. I don't know how far to extend that term. So that's why I haven't used it in writing yet.
Makes sense.
But it's so catchy.
It is. It's cute.
And I like it.
Everyone responds to it right away when we hear it.
Yeah.
Right. And you were talking, Dana, about like sounds that, like sound effects that become, maybe if you're enculturated into playing video games and you start to hear a sound in a new game and you're like, oh, I think I know what that means, because even though it's abstract, it's similar to things you've heard before. I feel like this is another example of, there are games that continue to use these kinds of abstract sounds when dialogue is happening, and when you hear it, you're just kind of like, oh, okay. Don't even maybe pay attention to it that much, because it's just, that's what games do sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, there's this whole musical and auditory vocabulary that we get used to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the designers are trying to, I think that means that there's sort of if you want it to be instantly intelligible, you're going to want it to share some features with how it's being used in other games, timbrally or rhythmically or, whatever it may be. So then that ends up creating these sort of like families of sound effects where like you might not have a percussive hit sound for healing, because that could very easily get read as damage by the player. So yeah, we make these associations and then we continue to reify them over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Lyric schemata, yeah.
Yeah, and then if you're going to violate that, you have to do it in such a way where it teaches the player that like it's different in this game, and here's how we're doing that. And I think for a lot of people, that's like, why reinvent the wheel if unless there's like a very specific reason that you want that kind of ambiguity or for the player to kind of be destabilized a little bit in that understanding. Maybe I'm not a sound designer, but I imagine they have these things in their head too from all the games they've played.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah.
So when a player talks with other inhabitants of the game's virtual world, the resulting dialogue appears gradually, symbol by symbol, as text within single quotation marks in a box on the screen. As long as the visual components of this speech are appearing, a very brief but repeated tone on the pitch A5 plays on the second pulse wave channel, and an earcon. This is an earcon that reinforces the text appearing on screen. And I'll tell you, I tried to record my emulator, and it was not recording the sound, because QuickTime Screen Record does not want to record internal sound. So let me see if I can just pull up, because I meant to insert just a little long play moment.
While you're pulling this up, Dana, is like a little behind the scenes stuff. So the reason why I started looking at this example is kind of by accident. I was teaching a class on video game music, and we had an NES day where I brought in the NES and like 4 random games that I pulled off of the shelf. And one of them was Dragon Quest, and we were playing it and kind of thinking about what we were hearing. And we all, like me and my students, we were all just like, well, how about that weird sound when people are talking? We were like, oh, wait, it's at pitch A. That's definitely related to the score. Like, oh, how interesting. Now, what? And then I got kind of obsessed with that sound. But that's how it started.
It's the first example of this happening, right? I think you said.
It's not the first, but it's really early. Actually, yeah. So The Legend of Zelda, the first Zelda game, was also released in 1986, and it has a couple examples also of this.
Okay.
And I'm not entirely clear on which would have come first. And then there are some earlier, there's an earlier example by the same development company, Chunsoft, for computers, and then Famicom, which is 1985. So they at least were using the same kind of idea.
Yeah.
Although that game doesn't have any score.
Gotcha.
It's just dialogue sound. Anyway, it's early.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the reason I had actually wanted to capture my own footage of this or open it live, I'm having problems configuring RetroArch, so I really got to work on that. Like, it has everything fast forwarded, and I can't turn it off. I'm like, I need to reconfigure some things in RetroArch to make it work on this computer. I have a different one, a different emulator, multi-emulator on my Mac, and I was having problems recording it so that I could use it as like a video. Anyway, the reason I wanted to do that, which unfortunately we won't get a full taste of here, is you can select the dialogue speed, and then the sound, the pitched A5 speeds up or slows down relative to that. And of course the actual speed at which the dialogue displays speeds up or slows down. And so there's a slow, there's a normal, and there's a fast. So I'll be curious to see what this person selects. Probably fast.
Probably fast. Most of the videos are fast.
Yeah. Oh, they played through the whole. Nice. Begin a new quest. Let's see what they name themselves. Hopefully nothing bad.
Yeah, dang. Okay, I've watched this video before.
Fast.
It prompts you right at the beginning.
May the light shine upon thee. Great. So you can hear that that's different from the selecting in the menu. It's a different pitch, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. And of course, those are more tied to your actions. This is just happening anytime dialogue is happening. But you note that it does not show up when you are being told, like, oh, you got this out of this chest. Or something like that. So even it is tied directly to the speaking.
Yeah, and those two kinds of messages look very similar. Like that, it's still white text gradually appearing on a black background, but you only get the sound when it's a character speaking. So.
Yeah, neat stuff. Yeah. Apparently Skype just keeps like resizing the window, so I try to keep an eye on it, but yeah, folks keep popping. As I see it, I will try to fix it. Yeah, keep having that problem. I don't know why. I haven't had that problem when it's just one person, but maybe multiple NDI sources. I don't know. Yeah, see, it's like resizing. Just automatically. It's like nothing's happening. I don't understand why it's just auto resizing. Why? Yeah, so just so you know, that's not me. I'm trying to put things back in normal sizing. But yeah, it keeps just like resizing indiscriminately. So I'm not sure. I know Pumpy Heart's kind of a good Twitch person, so if you have any thoughts as to why it's doing that and can help me fix that, that'd be great. Otherwise, I will just try to keep an eye on it. So yeah, we have this consistent tone that's being kind of repeated in a regular time interval, which can evoke a larger category of sounds that accompany transmission of text through technological means. So we might hear this as a typewriter typing out, since the letters appear individually as the text happens. Or we could hear this as Morse code, which I love.
Dana, I should have cited you on that. I'm pretty sure you made a comment after a talk that I gave, and you said, I think I remember it was you, unless it was someone else, but I thought I remembered you saying that playing some games early when you were a kid, you might have even tried to transcribe some of the sounds and make it like, is this Morse code? Yeah, okay, so but that's why I put that there, because I was like, oh, I know someone who has literally thought this could be Morse code. So
it was these games in particular. And again, I played 3 before I played the first one, but it is a NDI source in Streamlabs, which is essentially OBS. But yeah, to explain to everyone there. Yeah, Morse code, good stuff. I don't mind. It's not like I had any publication on it.
Well, it's like, okay, at least I can say, like, I didn't just make that up. Like, at least one person.
At least one person.
Sounds like Morse code.
Yeah, I used to have my little Walkman recorder, and I would hold it up to the screen, the little speaker on the TV, and then I would record music that way too, where I would like have it paused, or I'd have somebody in a safe area where they weren't gonna. And then I recorded all of the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack that way. So that was like the way that I had the soundtrack. Because back then, you could get bootlegs from Japan, maybe, if you knew. But I was a kid, so like I didn't know. I don't know about that. This was before things were so accessible on the internet, too. It's like you could go to Napster, maybe, but half the time you download it, it wouldn't be what it said it was. You'd be like, okay, cool. This is not at all the music I was looking for, so... Piracy wasn't necessarily easier. But yeah, I didn't have a Talkboy. No, I just had like a regular like Walkman, you know. But I remember that scene from Home Alone 2 making a lot of sense. Beep speech as music? Question mark? So this is where the blurring happens. Like clearly it's representing the dialogue, and we can take that as being typing or Morse code, but it's an A5, it's pitch, and it's repeating. So it can be absorbed into the musical texture by the notion of agreeing harmonically with the musical theme underneath. So the music can absorb other audio elements if they agree with the score in terms of pitch and meter. If it's distinct enough, I think you're able to sort of go, okay, that's, you know, like again, Heart and Zelda, like that is not resolving itself into the melody in such a way because it wants to warn you, wants to be dangerous. And so it kind of it shouldn't absorb, because then it wouldn't be as effective at communicating like, hey, you might want to get a heart. You are about to die. So here, though, the Castle Room theme, we have the opening of it here, and 68% of the time, the A5 for the dialogue agrees with the harmony. So there's either an actual A somewhere sounding in a different octave, or it's consonant so that the A sounds good with it. And actually, I was just working on, again, for Will's chapter. Let's go ahead and throw up the Muse score, because I was retranscribing his examples, because the copy of his chapter I have is not very clear. And so I decided I'm just going to redo all of them. And so let's just I'll play that really quick. Assuming I have the right window capture, add source.
And I gotta say, Elizabeth, I really appreciated your very precise, like 68%, or
I
like
loved that.
yeah, it's like
that brought me joy. That sparked a lot of joy.
Yeah, that's again stuff that came out of the approach I was working on in my dissertation, which is now the Music Theory Online article about smoothness.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I wanted a way to very precisely say how frequently are these things that could sound at the same time, how often were they actually going to combine in a way that agrees, for example through consonants or agree in pitch.
Yeah, so let me play a little bit of this. It's in A minor to answer Andrew's question, and it's very baroque-y. It's a little fast, but whatever. Will didn't have a tempo marking on his transcription. So that first segment repeats. This is a preview of next week. And then it goes back to the beginning. So there's that one. Yeah, Yeah, I'm retranscribing Will's examples just because, again, I couldn't get as clear of a picture as I could here out of the book. So, and yeah, even, I don't know, sometimes when they put things from transcriptions into a book, I don't know, it's like the clarity isn't always perfect. So, yours look very nice, by the way. What do you use, by the way, for your transcriptions?
I'm pretty sure I did them in Finale.
Finale.
Yeah.
Always interesting to me. Finale versus Sibelius versus MuseScore.
MuseScore now, especially, yeah.
MuseScore's great. I'm a total convert. I stopped paying for Sibelius because I was like, I can get everything I need. So
I have the last version of Finale that you could just own, so that's what I'm sticking with for now. But I need to start learning MuseScore a bit better because I know it's free and just more accessible for
I like the forums
people,
too.
so.
If I forget how to make like a septuplet, I just type in MuseScore septuplet and something comes up. I love it. I love being able to just Google everything. I find that very helpful. Yeah. So, and you'll notice, this just goes to show you how we parse things differently. Notice how rhythmically Elizabeth has transcribed it using eighth notes. But if we go back...
And did you do 16th notes?
Well, this is what Will did. Will did 16th notes. So.
Well, maybe maybe that's more... in line with a Baroque style. I'm not super enculturated in Baroque music, besides playing it in piano lessons many years ago.
Let's remember to ask Will.
Will
why he quantized, because this is always a question that I have when I'm doing transcriptions too. Is like I try to kind of base it on how the harmony is changing. Does it make more sense to have a 4-measure period here than an 8-bar period in the Baroque in like kind of a binary dance form?
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
I feel like yours may be the way. I don't know.
You think 8 bar is a little more normative?
Maybe. But we'll ask Will. Will's going to be our expert on this. We'll ask. Maybe there wasn't even a worry about that. Maybe it was just get the notes down. Because that's a thing too. And actually seeing Will do transcriptions, it's not really his jam generally. He can go a whole chapter not talking about like a specific piece of music, because he's really interested in kind of social uses of music. So he always laughs that he's like, you transcribe everything, but like, for him, he's less interested in that a lot of the time. So
chapter... Also with the comment from Elizabeth in the chat, being more idiomatic for a Baroque keyboard piece, I was also just noticing that some of the, notes that are technically played by one channel are showing up in the left hand. So like... Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because he had octaves, didn't he? He had
right.
And that was actually something that I was thinking about, and how like, my transcriptions are always channel by channel. So I would do it. I would do it like more like yours. This.
Which, that looks more like keyboard music for sure.
Yeah, this is Will's transcription. I just retranscribed it. So, like, to be clear, this isn't my transcription. This is the one that's in Will's chapter for next week. I just wanted one that we could play off of the notation like this. Just, because it's pretty. And I liked how crisp it looks when it's newly transcribed. But in general, if I can just take a good, like, screenshot of whatever it is, then I do that. So that's what we have here, Elizabeth's transcription. But yeah, it's interesting that like quantizing it, it's intelligible either way musically. So sometimes there are, not particularly good reasons it has to be one way or the other. And it's not like it was coming out of a score originally where you're like getting it right or wrong. So yeah, but yeah, 68% of the time, based on that sort of A minor tonality that we're sitting in, that A5 sounds really congruent with everything. So you could read it as part of the music, or it's at least musical enough that it gets absorbed.
Yeah, I think I point out that the like the rhythms of the sound repeating would probably still keep it from totally being absorbed into the sense of the music. Like, so it's probably semi-musical rather than
a degree of distinction. Like we said, a degree of distinction helps it helps it be distinct and still convey information to the player.
And I call that disjunction.
Yes, that's true. You have other work on this.
Yeah.
And a degree of disjunction is actually like necessary and really helpful. See, like I resized.
Totally.
I don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
The window sizes just keep jumping, but anyway, the A5 for the dialogue effect can be read as both like a musically stable drone for both the castle theme in A minor and the town theme in F major, where it's emphasizing that third scale degree. So it's even pretty tonal with the town theme as well. And the dialogue sound is always connected directly to speech, not to other on-screen text, even though on-screen it will look the same. You know, the white text on the black background in the box. And so the sound allows players to make to imagine the characters, imagine the characters speaking, or even treat the sound as like evidence of chanting or intoning the text. I really liked that thought.
Just
at
being
the
a
end.
little imaginative there, yeah.
Yeah, that you could think like maybe in this world they intone everything.
I mean, maybe they do. You could imagine it that way.
Yeah, I love that. So then we get to the point of this isn't just old games. This isn't like, oh, that was back when they couldn't do they couldn't get voice actors because it still happens. And actually there are games that like really use it to great effect. So despite the ability to now have the space and, maybe you don't have the budget to hire voice actors, but you might be able to have like a couple people on your team do the voice acting. We have the ability to do it, but the blurring occurs pretty regularly. So there are a lot of these games like Undertale and Ace Attorney, and you mentioned Animal Crossing that still use that. And I think the Mario games and stuff do that too. There's like a playfulness. And you said in particular, Nintendo often kind of musicalizes its sound effects to imply that sort of play space. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum here, Aviary Attorney, which is a fantastic game. Have you played that, Elizabeth?
Oh, no, but it's on, I've noticed it.
We started it. I think we may have done like a week of it, and it was so good. It was so fun.
I should play it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I recommend
Great.
it. That's a good,
Yeah,
good summer one.
If you think about like like games that continue to use these sounds, I've noticed that like once a game in a series starts doing it, the later games will continue. So like the recent Dragon Quest games also still use this sound. And the recent Ace Attorney games, even though they now have like full cutscenes with full voice animation, they keep the same, almost exactly the same sound effects as the early games, which is super interesting.
Yeah, you're right. It's like a franchise continuity kind of thing at that point. Yeah. Horror games, though, on the other end, they often use non-musical sound objects in their scores to create ambiguity and fear, where you're like, okay, is that piece of metal clanging because there's an enemy there that is going to come at me and kill me? Or is it part of the musical texture? And that ambiguity is where a lot of the fear, as we saw in Will Ayer's work on the Dolphin and Perception specifically, the game designer there said, what was it? Information is the enemy of fear. So that not being able to parse that into the soundscape and know like, wait, is that a sound effect? Is that a signal of something? A lot of horror games use that and they capitalize on it and they want you to be freaked out by it. So they use it. And so ear cons are kind of already sitting between the like auditory icon and music as music, because they cross the boundaries because they're often semi-musical to start. So not that you couldn't ever have an auditory icon get parsed into the musical texture again, like the horror games might be using a very real sound that gets kind of rhythmicized in a way where you're kind of treating it as part of the soundscape. But like ear cons are particularly good for this. Yeah, it's Aviary Attorney is a great game. Recommend.
I'll just jump in also with Elizabeth Hamilton just said in the chat too that indie games seem to maybe use a lot of beep speech, and I'm starting to get to the point where if I start to play an indie game, I'm kind of expecting that it's going to use beep speech. So I also don't have data for that, but I also am sensing that might be true, which is not to say that big games don't also use it. Like I said, the recent Dragon Quest games still use it, but like, yeah, could be an indie thing.
Yeah, it could, and that could be like just both for the aesthetic of it as well as a budgetary thing. It could be a limitation, like, oh, we don't have the money to hire all these voice actors, but it could just be we like that effect.
Yeah.
It reminds us of games we played growing up or something.
I was gonna say, like, a lot of indie games, not all, of course, but a lot of them have that retro aesthetic that they're going for, and so that this very much speaks to that.
Yeah, like graphics and everything too. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of these things are all playing a role. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. Sorry.
Yeah, I love it.
I know
Will's working on indie games too, so I would be curious to ask him next week. What's his lay of the landscape there? Like, has he felt like most of them have had speech? We'll have to ask him. I'm really liking I just kind of booked people as I could book them for this stream, or the Ludo group already had y'all scheduled, but things have been like having some serendipitous callbacks and like ability to maybe like ask forward some questions. So we'll have to keep track and continue the conversations like across people's articles too. I think that'll be something cool to develop. So happens in more recent games, and here's a good example where we can bring an auditory icon into the realm of music. In Mario Kart 8 in Shy Guy Falls, there are parts where we specifically go past mining happening, and it sounds very congruent with everything else happening. It's kind of this like you're hitting a crystal almost sound, like you're mining rocks or whatever, but it has like a high pitch where I kind of read it almost as like we're mining crystals specifically. And it sounds very good with everything else, but it only happens when you're driving right by that section. The rest of the track doesn't have it. So here's a little bit of that. Very like rhythmic, right? Tink, tink. So we're gonna read that as kind of just it like adds that extra layer. But I guess does Yoshi in Super Mario World, like how he adds the extra percussion line? Is that kind of in the same area? Is that a sound effect for Yoshi, or is that just the music is now reflecting that Yoshi is in play?
That's a great question. Does it line up with like Yoshi's footfalls? So I know I've never thought of it that way. I always just thought of it as music. As a percussion layer.
We're gonna look.
That's a great question, because
SNES long play here.
I mean,
somewhere where he just.
It might also be hard to tell. Let's just slow it down.
All right, switching. A lot of switching back and forth today. It's a good test.
Also, Kate, I'm super interested in what you're working on there.
Oh wait, there's
with animals speaking.
Yoshi, yay! I guess it doesn't really it can't line up with his footsteps because you're controlling how fast or slow he moves.
Right. Oh, good point. And there's kind of this like
It does have that galloping though, where you're like, oh, that's clearly Yoshi, right?
I kind of feel now. Yeah, I'm kind of thinking about that.
Yeah. Huh. Serendipity, love it.
Fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool stuff. So it can just be like adding extra texture, which is really neat. And then you may not even notice it. Like when you do, it's kind of a neat moment where you're like, I mean, when you first tell someone about the Mario thing and they've like, I've never noticed that before. Like that's a really cool moment. And then you play it for them. We're like, holy moly, I've been playing this game my whole life and I never even knew that it like added a layer. So not everybody perceives it. That's always an important thing to know, is some people don't, like, it just sails and they don't pay attention or they don't hear it or they don't notice. So that's important. We also get a good example of this in Bit Trip Runner and games like this, where all the effects are integrating seamlessly into the score. And the better you perform, the more that it really just sounds like you are kind of helping create the music. Is that a good way to put that?
Yeah, I think so.
So all of the sound effects are, congruent with the underscoring. This is actually a tool-assisted speed run. So this is like a perfect run being put in through like an algorithm has basically generated this gameplay. It's not a person playing, for anyone that doesn't do this sort of thing. So here is a little bit of a perfect Bit Trip Runner so we can hear how musical the whole soundscape is together. I like how more layers are getting added there. What's really neat about that one is it's different pitches on different jumps.
If I'm remembering correctly, that might be randomized. Like, it might not be the same each time you play the game.
But it all fits.
It's
Yeah.
congruent, yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds
and
like you're helping make the music.
Yeah, and I totally got this example from a chapter by Steve Reale. So there's many more details about how the sounds and music in this game work in his chapter. I think 2014.
I'm trying to remember where that is.
Is that in the pink book?
Is that in the pink
I think it's in the pink book,
Yeah.
Good stuff.
if I remember correctly.
And then finally, we get to Super Mario Galaxy. Hence the background for the slides this week. I almost went with Dragon Quest, but Will talks about it next week, so we'll do the Dragon Quest background for the PowerPoint next week. I'm glad I went with Super Mario Galaxy. It's very pretty, too. I liked the blue, so... And I found the fonts that actually matched were kind of dupes of the in-game. I love doing that. I look up like Super Mario Galaxy font, and then there's someone on like one of those free sites that like, here's me trying to make one that looks just like the one in the game. Looks pretty good, I think. Both the title one and the kind of dialogue one. So in this game, for anyone who hasn't played, he goes to different galaxies. And you select them from maps within domes in the Comet Observatory. And you use a Wiimote. So you point at the galaxy and it brings up different info about it, like its name. And the controller will vibrate. And you also hear an earcon of sort of a glockenspiel-like tone there. And the pitch of the tone is chosen from within a set of possible pitches, usually 4 to 5, from the underlying harmony of the musical track. So here's that image. It's beautiful. I didn't retypeset this because it's so beautiful as it is. So I think you were telling me, because I was like, yeah, I could probably do the bottom bits here, but up here where you have the floating pitches available, like it's just so gorgeously structured. Did you photoshopped that, you said?
Yeah, there was Photoshop involved.
Oh, it looks so good.
Yeah.
It's just
I'm sure there's a way to do that in some, like, people who know how to use, like, Sibelius to great, to the best uses, but I don't, so.
Yeah, I don't know. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful, I love a good transcription, so this is one of my faves.
Nice.
So here we have
I get to use the
everything
15
beneath it.
MA,
Yeah.
2 octaves above.
To show how high it is. I love that. So we have all the synth things happening underneath it, and then here's all of the... How did you figure out what pitches were available? Did you just play over and over and over and over? Yeah. Okay. I figured, because this isn't something that you could really get under the hood.
No,
in the same
I
way.
wouldn't know how to. I don't even know if, maybe someone can, but
I feel like a lot of Nintendo stuff is like a little harder to break in that way, but I don't know.
And I mean, the nice thing about doing this with the Wiimote and just the way that the system is set up is you can just really quickly like move the Wiimote on and off of a galaxy, and it'll play like a whole ton of different, like it'll go a whole bunch of different pitches, bunch of different pitches. So, and just record and then transcribe.
Nice.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
I did appreciate your little note that what was it? The Wiimote can be a bit finicky or something like
Well,
that too. And I was like, yeah, that's
yeah.
yes.
Yes, I
Right.
loved that as well because I struggle with that, like keeping it in the same spot. So you mentioned like slipping off.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that pitch set for the ear cons are all members of the underlying harmony, and it pretty much agrees with the score. It's usually doubling a tone that's elsewhere, somewhere lower in the harmony, or again, it's consonant with it, just like that A5 in the Dragon Quest examples. So the dissonant sounds were only 12% of the time against the underlying score, but you said even this can resolve within that same measure because the decay trail of the sound can actually agree with the harmony on the next beat.
Yeah, the sound effect is like a nice like resonant like glockenspiel hit. So like it'll keep playing. So even if like the moment when you point at the galaxy and you start to hear the sound, even if that pitch is dissonant at that moment, it'll keep playing and then the music will catch up with it basically.
Yeah.
So
I'm trying to see if I have a good moment of this queued up. Go to the observatory. I'll keep looking for that. But yeah, I can actually agree with it on the next beat, which is neat.
yeah, right.
And that also
Yeah,
creates a
'cause-
possibility for even more play, right?
Yeah, and Tim Summers in Understanding Video Game Music has a few pages on like his like playful experience with Super Mario Galaxy and like kind of discovering these interactive musical like toys basically that don't have to be there in the game, but it's this fun little secret you can find and discover while you're playing, and then you can play around with it and sounds nice no matter what you do. So basically part of Nintendo's aesthetic, I think. Just fun and playful.
Yeah, I think this is here. They've discovered a new galaxy, so hopefully we'll hear a little bit of this. It's not the same as if, again, I had recorded my own, but I'll do more of that once my class is over. I'm in grading. Not even grading. I'm doing developmental feedback this summer with like almost no grading, but it's taking 10 times as long. Discovered a new galaxy. Oh wait, I have to switch it over for you all. So.
Oh wow, look at that. It's so jumpy.
Wow.
Ah,
Jeez.
Temperamental.
whoops.
Yeah.
Whoops. Oh. Oh goodness. Okay. Where was I? Is the question. Long plays, man.
Yeah. Hard to get exactly where you want when it's how long is that? A really long video.
So it's so quick because they're not going to stop and play with it, but you can kind of hear that shimmering, like very high tone over everything else as we're going to pick where we want to go next.
Yeah, I have a video because this was in my dissertation, this example. So I have a video where I spend 30 seconds like just moving around so you can hear the stuff. If you want me to find a link for it, I could
That would be
probably.
awesome. Yeah, throw that in the like the resources tab in the Discord, maybe.
I don't know how fast I'm gonna be able to
Well,
find it.
yeah,
Maybe
for that, do it like
later.
later.
Okay,
'Cause
great.
I would love to see that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Back. There we go.
But that's the thing, right? Is that it's something that you might never notice. Like it could be something that just goes by really fast.
Yeah, but as soon as you stop to notice, like, oh, this is fun, like, and
Yeah,
you say
have
that
fun
like
with
you
it.
can discover this kind of at random by having, having it slip to a different spot, and then you hear like you can kind of like jump back between them and like move them around, and you can get playful with it, and you can kind of make music against the underlying track that's happening, the synth drones and everything that are happening. So. In short, here's more of the same. The sound design in Super Mario Galaxy allows for, but does not insist on, a particular type of musical play that complements and deepens the game's playful aesthetic, which a lot of Nintendo games have elements of this.
I think so.
Yeah. And so there's another blurred line, and it is very specifically and intentionally being deployed. So our conclusion is that music, sound effects, and dialogue each bring a wide variety of effects to video games, and the potential for innovative and engaging experience with players only expands when the boundaries between these three sonic categories blur. Beautiful. Well, Stefan, do we have any more questions, concluding thoughts?
Yeah, just one final question, and I personally kind of know the answer to this for reasons, but so it's a two-part question. So in this chapter, you bring in quite a bit of examples for blurring the lines between the different audio categories. Are there any good other good examples that did not make it into the chapter? And are there examples you found aside from horror games where the dissonance between music and sound effects was especially jarring?
Ooh. Especially jarring is, I'm kind of taking these backwards, I guess, because
Yeah, that's fine.
I think the question, like whether something's going to be jarring or not, might have to do with whether you're specifically paying attention to it or listening to it. Because I think, so kind of one way that I think about like the situations when there's like disjunction between like a sound effect and a score, or like a musical score, one way to think about it is that like if the fact that those two things, even though they're happening at the same time, don't fit well together, then they might just become like perceived as separate auditory streams. Like, and so it might not feel jarring. It might not sound bad. It might not feel jarring. It might just feel like those are two different things. Like the fact that, you know, you're at a party and you're talking, but there's also music playing, right? But there are definitely examples where I'm like thinking really hard about what the sound sounds like while I'm playing, and I kind of want them to be musical, or I want them to fit together, and then the fact that they don't makes me angry. Like, or I feel then that it's like it's jarring. Like we're talking about beep speech a lot, and I think about it a lot. There are some examples where there will be games that like on an NES or a SNES, where they'll use pitches for the beep speech that are detuned from the score, like not even like the same chromatic 12 pitches, like they're detuned, they're not in tune at all. And if I'm thinking about it as this could be music, then I think of it as like, ouch, that hurts. But and it's like jarring. But if I don't think of it that way, it's no big deal. It's just a sound effect that isn't trying to be part of the music. It's just a different stream, which is, again, really fascinating. I just think it's interesting.
And that the same player can have both of those responses depending on how they're attending. Yeah,
I think so. And this isn't something that I've like, you know, done deep research on or anything, but it kind of makes sense based on, to me anyway, based on my experiences and you know, some general perception stuff, I guess. And then for your first question, like things that aren't in here. So I did like a passing reference in this chapter to the stuff that I've thought about in Flower. So I have a separate chapter about Flower.
We're going to do that one in October.
In October. Which again, Stefan, your background makes me think of the game Flower. I just it makes me want to play. So but there are definitely, I feel like in that game, like that's also a really good example where the sound effects are musicalized in a way, and it was intentional on the part of the game designers too. Like they were thinking about jazz and they were thinking about improvisation kinds of music making, but at the same time they're sound effects. Like it's a sound of a flower blooming, or it's saying, good job, you just you know, you did the thing you were supposed to do, even though this is kind of a weird thing to control. Like and then I'm working right now on thinking more about abstract representations of sound of voices in video games. So I don't, in this chapter that we just talked about today, I don't spend a lot of time on dialogue specifically. Like there's the Dragon Quest example, but I hadn't been thinking super deeply about it at that point, and I've been thinking more about it and continuing to think about it, because I think that video games, I don't know, it's just such a, people have done so many like imaginative, creative things with sounds in games, including voices and dialogue, in ways that I just feel like hasn't really shown up in other media as much as, you know, video games have opened the door to people to be creative and you know, what kinds of interesting meanings can we get out of those sounds?
Yeah.
So that's where my mind is right now.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, most of the other questions were answered via, or like as we were going through these. So I mean, that's just how it happens, I think.
Cool.
But
Yeah. Yay.
Love it. And Andrew is thanking you. Great work.
Thank
As
you.
always great work. And yeah, I actually, funny story, as I was like looking ahead, I sent Elizabeth an email because I hadn't looked closely enough at the AMS Ludo group to see that you were already scheduled for this chapter. And I was like, I love Flower. Can we do the Flower chapter? And you were like, I'm already coming on your stream in June. I was like, oh, shoot, you are. So because I love that one, we are going to probably do it sometime in October, I think.
That'd be great.
Yeah, I love that chapter. I want an excuse to play some of that footage, and maybe we'll play some of the, hook up the game and do some of it in real time.
Even though I've spent so much time thinking about Flower and playing Flower, I still like, I bring it into my classes whenever I get an excuse. Like it's the game that I want to have people try out, especially like if they've never played games before.
Yeah.
And they kind of want to know, like, and I want to get them interested. So yep, looking forward to it.
Love that gameplay. Love the whole soundscape of it. And I wouldn't have even discovered the game without your AMS paper that was the kind of the seed of that one. So it's neat to see how these things grow. And that's why I always ask about the process too, because I think that's really interesting. And I like, you know, here was a good example where this wasn't, I, you know, wrote this up and it was peer reviewed and, you know, anonymously by a journal. This was specifically Tim and Melanie reached, I don't know if they had people submit to them. I think they pretty much just reached out to every single person.
Yeah.
I think so.
And I remember for me, they gave me like a very small subset of chapter. You could write on one of these. And then I ended up doing like the cognitive and physiological because that was like something I was going to abandon from my dissertation that won't go in the eventual book. So I was like, here, take this because it doesn't have a home. So now it's a more like user-friendly, you know, the chapter got chopped in half, so it's not as unwieldy as the actual dissertation chapter. They were able to like help streamline it, but I felt like because it had already been vetted as a dissertation chapter, it was like the smoothest publishing process I've ever had. It was like barely touched, you know, it was mostly like, does it still make sense when I've chopped it up? But gosh, that's a nice thing when you're when it's smooth. But at the same time, like the chapter that is my favorite that I've ever done is the one that got the most like shredded in the editing process, and that is the Green Book chapter on the Cleopatra game that Uematsu scored before Final Fantasy.
Yeah,
because it was one of those things where like I was going off into all these different areas because I'm always trying to bring in so many different fields and triangulate, and Steve actually hit upon reality was like, this is the interesting thing, do that, like make the whole chapter about this and not the other, you know. He's like, the other stuff is great but could you maybe rewrite the entire chapter and do this thing instead? And I was like, initially I was like, oh, that's a lot of work, but I liked it. I instantly was like, oh yeah, that is the way to go with this. So it's nice when you have an editor that you have a good relationship with. And they work with you and, you know, they help you go, okay, you did all this groundwork, but here's the good part of this. Like, here's the part that makes this like really dynamite. And then you're like, yeah, cool. And then you just know that what comes out is the best version of it that it could be. It's
Yay.
a nice thing.
Yeah.
All right. And Elizabeth, anything you want to plug? Maybe tell people about JSMIG?
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, I feel like that's what I always say. But yes, we have a journal of sound and music and games. Please submit. we really try to do like what Dana was just saying, like helping people to make their scholarship the best version of it that it can be, and we're very supportive. It's Tim Summers and I are doing most of the stuff, but we've got awesome board members and supportive people, and our reviewers are awesome. And
I'm one of them. I'm a reviewer.
Yes.
Same.
I've only done a couple,
awesome
but
reviews,
I really
stuff.
take to heart the whole like developmental, like even if I'm like, please like revise and resubmit, it's always, I like this and I want this to be like,
Yes.
and I
yeah.
actually had one of those where I was like, this is really interesting, like follow this breadcrumb, you know? Like
Yeah.
I try to really think about tone and not just being like reviewer too, even if something needs work still, because
Yeah.
ultimately, like you think about this being a representation to the rest of the non-Ludo field too, that they're going to pick this stuff up and, you know, make judgments about what the Ludo people are doing. And we want to make sure that they're going, whoa, look at this. This is like really rigorous. And like, this is some great stuff that's happening.
Yeah.
So we all got to lift each other up in that. So.
Yeah, and I'll plug too, you know, since this chapter that we were just talking about, since this has come out, there's been more research on like what does voice acting add to games, like what are the functions of voices in games. So and you can find at least a couple of those in the Journal of Sound and Music in Games that are specifically about voices and what do they add to the game experience. So if you're interested in that, search around there and you'll find some stuff.
But yeah, that's it for today. Thank you all for joining us. I know I'm getting kind of luxurious with the time. In general, I always try to do a hard stop at about 2 hours, and that's not true. I probably won't ever shut us down until it seems like we're ready. As long as the authors don't need to be, you know, out the door at a certain time, then I like our chill Friday hangs. So in general, though, in my head, it's like, okay, at least an hour. And then if it goes to an hour and a half or closer to 2, because we're having good conversation, that's great too. That's the whole vibe. So thank you so much for being here, both of you.
Yeah, thank you.
I love the synergy with the AMS group.
Very cool.
And just that, you know, you had this beautiful idea and now we're able to like take it from, I don't know if it was going to be like a Zoom meeting or, you know, whatever the original plan for the book club, but to like kind of turn it around and make it something like this where there's going to be a VOD and we can refer back as needed if it's at all useful. It's fun.
And just collaborative in general, I think.
Yeah. I love it. I get to see you all and hang out with you all. It's so much fun. So join us next week for it is Will Gibbons next week, right? I'm not skipping ahead of myself.
That's right.
Yeah, next week is Will.
That's what I remember.
Little Harmonic Labyrinths, Baroque musical style on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And this was kind of fun because I asked when it was a big ask for Will because I feel like Will doesn't Twitch very much. So when I was like, hey, come be on my stream, and he was like, yeah, that'd be great. I was like, awesome. And then I sort of said, you have a lot of publications. What do we start with? And so I was like, okay, let's not do Blip Bloop Bach. Everyone, like pretty much everyone's read that one. That one's had a lot of exposure. So I was like, what's something that you feel like hasn't been read as much because of where it is? And it was this Little Harmonic Labyrinths because it's in a book recomposing the past representations of early music on stage and screen. So it's not like a video game specific volume. And so because of that, it's got a lot of like film and actual opera staging and things like that. So he's the only video game chapter, I think, in this one. So a lot of people aren't going to buy this book. I actually bought it because I taught a medievalisms course in the spring, and so I actually used some of the film scholarship from this. But before that, I only had like a PDF of his chapter that he was generous enough to send me. So now I own it. But a lot of people haven't read it because of where it is. So that's sort of the thought with like the Will Gibbons and the Tim Summers among us that have so many good publications, or like Karen Cook even, like y'all have too many good things. Where do we start? So we'll get to the other ones too if they're willing to come back, if y'all are willing to come back. So but yeah, we're going to do more Dragon Quest. He uses Warrior because he's looking at the US one, but Dragon Quest and the music. So it's a beautiful continuation from this. So join us next week. thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. This was
Yeah,
great.
thank you.
And enjoy your weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.